What's up, guys? Today we're going to finish our notes packet, starting with the origin of species. So, Darwin wrote The Origin of Species, and it was published on November 24th, 1859. And the full title was On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or it was also titled Preservation of Favored Races and the Struggle for Life. And Darwin initially only wanted to share his research with the very select few. And he only published because Lyell urged him after Russell Wallace published an article very similar. And so Darwin wanted to claim this idea. So in Darwin's time, there was no true mechanism to describe natural selection. So we needed to know how favorable variations could be transmitted to later genes. And with the rediscovery of Mendel's work in the early 20th century, we really found that missing link. And this right here is not necessarily evolution. Darwin and others were not suggesting that man came from apes and were monkeys at one point in time. We're just suggesting that we had a very common ancestor. Not it. So evolution is more like a branch or a tree rather than a lineage. And this is actually a drawing in his journal. Darwin is quoted in having written on the left-hand side. So Darwin proposed that organisms descended from a common ancestor. It was an idea that as individuals of a species and as they reproduce, they do change over time and they could change or diverge from a common form. And this would cause an evolution of a new species. It does take place over long periods of time. And natural selection can be observed in changes such as body structures, ecological structures, habitats, behaviors, etc. This is a body structure that demonstrates this modification that can change over time in terms of pennadactyl limbs, or five-fingered limbs. And here you can see, much like the human hand, bats and dolphins and anteaters, moles, horses, pigs, and monkeys all have fairly similar limbs and limb structures. So species today look a lot different from their ancestors. And each species has descended with changes from other species over time. So remember way back to that giant ground sloth that Darwin took bones from on his travels? This is the Megatherium. This is the giant ground sloth that was roughly the size of an elephant. This, again, descent with some modifications. Divergence is the accumulation of differences among two groups of the same species, and those differences become so different that they no longer interbreed, developing new species. Yet the common ancestor will remain. These are finches found on the South American mainland that we then see diverge into two very different species, the large ground finch and the cactus finch. These two finches, the cactus and the large ground, cannot reproduce with one another. Speciation is the formation of a new species. So divergence is the driving force behind this. So species can't have subspecies. For example, all dogs are the same species, Canis familiaris. But because of artificial selection, we have very different dogs. For instance, the Great Dane versus the Chihuahua. Those are subspecies. Subspecies are members of the same species that differ genetically because of genetic differences or living conditions. Our two models of evolution, one is gradualism, where we have gradual changes over a long period of time. And then there is punctuated equilibrium, in which we have rapid changes separated by periods of little or no change at all. In terms of evolutionary timescales, we have macroevolution, which is really long, can create or destroy species like the woolly mammoth or the mastodon, to modern day elephants. And then we have microevolution, which is short scale events. These were changes to phenotypes and genotypes that move generation to generation. For instance, the pepper moth that we actually talked about earlier in the class periods. So, what is our evidence for evolution? Well, there are 5 main points that we look at for evidence. We have embryonic development, microevolution, body structures, biological molecules, and the fossil record. So in terms of microevolution, we can see that in action small amounts of time, they occurred. This is in terms of microevolution, again, our second listed trait. And this is an example of peppered moths. They are changing from generation to generation very quickly. Antibiotic resistance and pesticide resistance. Evolution of pesticide resistance and natural selection happens very quickly, where the first generation exposed only leaves a few resistant, and a later generation becomes less resistant. And it also is the evolution of drug resistance in HIV. So we have variants susceptible, variants resistant, and the drug stops replication of susceptible variants. And so we drop our ability to have specific like diseases or illnesses. Similarities in DNA sequence or biological molecule. The idea is simple. The more two organisms are alike, the more their DNA is alike, and vice versa. So in looking at this specific photo, we can see that pigs and ducks are kind of alike, or pigs are really close. Pigs have 13, so we aren't very close. We are actually much closer to yeasts, which have 66. The more amino acids they have in common, the more they are like. Chimpanzees and humans share almost identical sequences. That's pretty cool. In terms of body structure, related structures are inherited from common ancestors. Structures have different mature forms, but develop in the same embryonic tissue, and it provides evidence that all four-legged animals with backbones descended or modified from a common ancestor. So, homologous body structures. Scientists noticed animals with backbones or vertebrates had similar bone structures, but they may differ in form or function. Like my arm is a little different than an alligator's arm. But the limb bones did develop in similar patterns, so things like arms, wings, legs, and flippers. These are homologous structures. You can see the human arm versus the dog, bird, and whale. We all have similar bones. We do have different functions because birds fly and whales swim. Vestigial structures are present in organisms, but pose no apparent purpose to us anymore. For example, we have appendices in humans. We also have tailbones in humans, legs on skinks, or the pelvis bones of a whale. In early development, embryonic structures of different species show significant similarities. So embryos are the early stages of vertebrate development. And this is comparative embryology. So we see different species, from fish to tortoises to hogs to rabbits and humans, and how similar we kind of look along our formation. Well, these are chickens, turtles, and humans. We have these pharyngeal pouches that are present during embryonic development that helps us maintain nutrition. which is actually pretty neat. And then finally, the fossil record. The fossil record is all information about past life that can provide evidence about history of life on Earth. And the fossil record is actually pretty incomplete because not all organisms are fossilized after death. And we know, or we can assume with pretty good theory, that 99% of all species have ever lived have become extinct. This is evidence for fossil record. These letter A is strata. So we see that over time, each of those different colors of rock are different time scales or different times at which bedrock had been laid down. But we have fossils inside. And then we have a fossilized sea urchin, which is at least 65 million years old, which is pretty cool. That's the end of our notes.